Ashkenazi Jews are a distinct and the largest subgroup of Jewish people who live in various parts of the world. The term Ashkenazi is derived from the name Ashkenaz, who, according to the book of Genesis, was the son of Gomer and a descendant of Noah. The origin of Ashkenazi culture can be traced to Europe, particularly the Rhineland region, where Jewish communities began forming during the early Middle Ages. Today, there are about 10 million Ashkenazi Jews worldwide, with more than 5 million residing in the United States, making up the overwhelming majority of the total Jewish population. In Israel, they make up approximately 40 to 50% of the total population. Their historical primary language is Yiddish, a Germanic language that has been influenced by several other languages over time. The earliest ancestors of all major Jewish diaspora communities, including Ashkenazi Jews, originated largely from the ancient Israelite or Judean populations of the Levant, roughly the area of present-day Israel or Palestine and nearby regions. Jewish communities began spreading across the Middle East and Mediterranean long before the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, especially after events such as the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. By the late Second Temple period, substantial Jewish communities already existed in places such as Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome itself. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey captured Jerusalem during a civil conflict in Judea, and brought the region under Roman influence. Over the following centuries, tensions between the Jews and the Roman Empire led to several major uprisings which included the First Jewish Revolt, in 66 to 73 CE, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt. These wars caused enormous destruction, mass killings, enslavement, and displacement. Many Jews were taken to other parts of the empire, while others migrated voluntarily for trade, commerce, or community ties. At the same time, significant Jewish populations continued to remain in the Levant for centuries afterward. By late antiquity, Italy had become an important center of Jewish life, and many scholars believe the ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews emerged from Levantine Jewish populations that mixed to some extent with Mediterranean populations, particularly in Italy, before later migrating into the Rhineland and Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages. Italy remained important, but conditions were not always stable, due to political fragmentation after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, changing control between Byzantine, Lombard, and later Frankish power and periodic local restrictions or instability. From around the 8th to 10th centuries, Jews began moving north from Italy into the Rhineland, modern Germany and northern France. It was a gradual shift driven by opportunity, politics, and changing economic networks. After the early medieval period, the Rhineland was becoming one of the most economically active parts of the Carolingian Empire. Jewish merchants, who were already experienced in long-distance trade from their time in Italy, were well positioned to take advantage of this. Moving north meant access to new markets and commercial roles. Once small Jewish communities formed in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Further migration followed through kinship and community networks. These communities developed a distinct identity known as Ashkenaz, the Hebrew term associated with Germany. A major feature of this identity was the formation of a unique religious tradition, often called the German Rite, which differed in liturgy, customs, and legal interpretation from other Jewish centers like those in Spain or the Islamic world. Social conditions also shaped Ashkenazism. Living as a protected but marginalized minority, Jews developed strong communal institutions and specialized in trade and finance. Cultural interaction with the surrounding German environment contributed to the emergence of Yiddish and other distinctive practices. They lived under the protection of local rulers, who valued their economic roles, but they also remained a religious minority in a Christian society that often viewed them with suspicion. This fragile coexistence was dramatically shattered at the end of the 11th century with the launching of the Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, the official goal was to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. However, the religious fervor that this call unleashed did not remain confined to the distant Holy Land. Instead, it ignited widespread hostility toward Jews within Europe itself, who were perceived by many as enemies of Christianity and held responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. As crusading armies and popular bands of fighters moved through France and the German lands in 1096, they turned their attention to the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. The immediate impact of these massacres on the Ashkenazi Jews of the Rhineland was catastrophic. Entire communities were destroyed, and the intellectual and cultural life of the region was severely disrupted. Jewish life in Western Europe remained unstable. Although some rulers offered protection, Jews were often dependent on fragile political arrangements and were increasingly excluded from many occupations. They were barred in many places from joining most craft guilds and were frequently restricted in land ownership. As a result, many Jews became involved in trade, moneylending, and tax farming. Occupations that were often economically necessary within medieval Christian restrictions on lending but socially controversial. This combination of economic usefulness and social vulnerability contributed to recurring expulsions and outbreaks of violence in various parts of Western Europe. Facing persecution and instability in parts of the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire and elsewhere in Western Europe, many Ashkenazi Jews gradually moved eastward into regions that offered comparatively greater opportunity and protection. The most important destination was Poland, along with neighboring Lithuania. Unlike much of Western Europe, these territories were still developing economically and politically, and local rulers sometimes encouraged Jewish settlement for their commercial and administrative skills. A key moment in this process was the issuance of the Statute of Kalish, 1264, which granted Jews legal protection, regulated judicial procedures, and offered a degree of communal and religious autonomy. This charter, later confirmed and expanded by subsequent Polish rulers, helped establish a relatively stable legal framework for Jewish settlement in parts of Poland. Over time, these lands became one of the most important centers of Ashkenazi Jewish life, especially from the late medieval and early modern periods. As communities became established in Eastern Europe, distinct Jewish communal structures developed. Organized communal institutions governed religious, legal, and social life. Rabbinic courts adjudicated disputes according to Jewish law, while communal councils managed taxation and welfare. A vibrant intellectual culture emerged, deeply rooted in Talmudic study and legal interpretation. At the same time, everyday life gave rise to Yiddish, a language that developed from medieval German dialects with significant Hebrew and Slavic influences, which became the primary spoken language of Ashkenazi Jews in much of Eastern Europe. One of the earliest large-scale episodes of mass violence in Eastern Europe occurred during the Khmelnytsky Uprising. This rebellion, led by Cossack forces against Polish rule, resulted in widespread massacres of Jews, who were often associated with the Polish nobility as tax collectors or estate managers. Estimates of Jewish deaths vary widely, but tens of thousands were likely killed, marking a traumatic turning point in Ashkenazi collective memory. In the centuries that followed, particularly after the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century, a large proportion of the Jewish population came under the rule of the Russian Empire. There, Jews were largely confined to the so-called Pale of Settlement, a region where they were legally permitted to reside. Although this area became a vibrant center of Jewish religious and cultural life, it was also marked by poverty, legal discrimination, and periodic violence. The most infamous forms of anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe were the pogroms of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The term pogrom, derived from Russian, refers to organized or semi-organized violent attacks against Jews, often involving looting, rape, and murder. The first major wave began in 1881, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Although Jews had no involvement in the assassination, they were widely scapegoated, and anti-Jewish riots spread across dozens of towns and cities in the empire. A second, more intense wave of pogroms occurred between 1903 and 1906, during a period of political instability and revolution. One of the most notorious incidents was the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, in which dozens of Jews were killed and hundreds of homes destroyed. These outbreaks were often fueled by anti-Semitic propaganda, economic tensions, and political unrest, and in many cases local authorities either failed to intervene or were complicit in the violence. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet policies abolished Tsarist legal discrimination against Jews, granting formal equality. However, during the Russian Civil War, many Jews, including Ashkenazi, suffered violent pogroms. Later, under Soviet rule, especially under Stalin, antisemitism was officially condemned, but Jewish religious and cultural life was heavily restricted, and state campaigns increasingly targeted Jewish intellectuals and institutions. In Nazi Germany, antisemitism became central to state ideology. Jews were systematically stripped of rights through laws like the Nuremberg Laws, excluded from public life, and subjected to escalating violence culminating in the Holocaust, in which about 6 million Jews were murdered, primarily in Eastern Europe. The large of Jews killed in the Holocaust were Ashkenazi. After World War II, Jews in communist Eastern Europe continued to face uncertainty. Although antisemitism was officially rejected, it persisted socially and sometimes politically. Periodic state campaigns and purges, such as in Poland in 1968 and the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia, led to repression and emigration. While these regimes did not pursue extermination like the Nazis, they often suppressed Jewish identity and contributed to the decline of Jewish communities and their emigration. When we look at the genetics, Ashkenazi Jews display a population bottleneck, as they descended from a smaller population in the Levant that became separated from the larger original population. They derive their ancestry from both the Levant and Europe, with the former being their source of origin and the latter constituting a principal component of their total ancestry. Their paternal ancestry is primarily of Levantine origin, whereas their maternal ancestry is mostly of European origin. Regarding their European ancestry, it is principally derived from Southern Europe, with a smaller contribution from Eastern Europe. The strict practice of endogamy, involving marriage within the community and often among related individuals, has increased the prevalence of certain genetic disorders such as Tay-Sachs disease, Crohn's disease, and cystic fibrosis.